Hello everyone, this is the third and final part of my tutorial series on the curves tool in Photoshop for landscape photographers. So in this video I'm going to talk about the color curves, the red curve, the green curve and the blue curve, and what they can do for our landscape photography edits. In the previous two videos, which I would suggest watching first, I started by discussing the luminance tone curve and went into some of the intricacies about specifically what was going on with that curve that will directly apply to these color curves. And in the second video, I looked at how you could apply the curve locally with the use of layer masks. So I would strongly suggest starting with those. But we are going to talk about the color curves in this video, and I'm going to start by explaining color channels because some of you might not actually understand what they are. And then I'm going to go on to a kind of trivial example to show you what you could do with the curves. And then finally, I'm going to actually go into something that might be useful to you. We're going to talk about how you might be able to remove haze using the curves tool. So let's get started. This is the photograph we're going to be working on, and just before I get into the video I thought I would talk about the image because it is quite an interesting one. This is Loch Maree in the northwest Highlands of Scotland, and Scotland, like the rest of the UK, has a very long history of deforestation. So I think we have just 2% of our ancient woodland remaining in the UK, of which this is one very small part, but of course it's a very beautiful part. These Scots pine covered islands, more or less untouched ecosystem here with this rather dramatic mountain backdrop. This is a mountain called Slioch the Spear. So it's a really dramatic and beautiful scene, but as a result it's quite useful from a messaging perspective when we talk about rewilding and ecosystem restoration. There are lots of organisations in the UK which are involved in that. Scotland, the Big Picture, is one of them, and images like this help to enthuse the public, showing them a vision of not just what Scotland was like in the past, but also what it could be in the future with some sensitive ecosystem restoration and the return of various species. So yeah, interesting image there to work on, but of course we're interested in it because it has some atmospheric haze. So as you look into the distance here, you can see a reduction in contrast, and you can also see a blue color cast being introduced. That's what atmospheric haze will commonly do. So we're going to be using the curves tool to improve the contrast, but also to cut down on that blue color cast. So that's where the color channels, the color curves are going to come in. But just before we talk about the curves, I am going to talk about the color channels because it's a fairly important concept to understand. So when we take digital photos, we capture the image in red, green and blue separately. And it's the combination of those three colors that give us the full color image. So I've mocked up an example of what these color channels would look like if you separated this image down into its red, green and blue constituent parts. And you don't need to worry about how I actually did this. It's completely irrelevant, but I just want you to understand what these color channels actually are. So if we just extracted the blue information from this full color image, this is what it would look like. So anywhere that's blue in the image, like the sky and the water, you see quite an intense color of blue, whereas anywhere that doesn't have much blue, it appears near black. So if we just go back to the image here, these shadow areas in the trees, well, there obviously isn't that much blue there. And we can see that when we look at the channel. But where the sky is blue and the water is blue, naturally the blue there is quite intense. And you can do that with respect to the other color channels. So this is the green color channel. You might be surprised to see that the water has a bit of green in it, and in fact it has some red too, and that's because the three color channels in combination also affect brightness. So you can look at the cloud up here and you will see that it is very blue and it is very green and it's also very red, and it's actually those three together that create a near white tone. So you can see it's like a warm white, this cloud here. So it's the combination of those three channels that give you the full color image, and it's sort of the difference between them that actually creates hues and saturation. So you can have a look through these color channels yourself actually in Photoshop. You just need to look at your channels palette here, and if you click on this palette and select the various channels, then you can actually see that same information, albeit it's not colored like I showed you there, but you can click on the red channel, the green channel and the blue channel and see exactly the same thing for whatever image you're working on. And you don't need to worry about these copies of the channels that I've made there, because you will just see this RGB and then the 3 individual color channels. So please do try to get a grasp of that, because it's a really useful thing to have an intuitive understanding of. And now we're going to start talking about how we can actually leverage some of that information. So we're going to start talking about the color curves. So let's create a new curves adjustment layer by clicking on the new adjustment layer icon and selecting curves, and it brings up the curves palette, which you should be familiar with by now. So we're looking at the RGB curve and the RGB histogram here, but if we click this drop down, we can actually select the individual color channels and the curves for those color channels. So now the histogram we're looking at is actually the red channel histogram, and up here I've loaded the histogram for the 3 color channels together, so it's like a composite view of the 3 channels, and you can see that those histograms correspond to the histograms that we see on the curves palette here. And understanding that you're looking at the color histogram and not the combined RGB histogram is useful, because it can help you to identify various things about your image in much the same way as you can with the RGB histogram. So let's start by just having a play with the curve itself. So this does work in exactly the same way as the RGB histogram, but only affecting one color at a time. So if we push the curve up, it makes things brighter, but because we're working in the red channel, we're making the red channel brighter, so we're adding red to the image across the board in this case. And if we drag it down, we're taking red away from the image. The opposite color to red in the color wheel is cyan, so you can see the more red I take away, the more cyan the image becomes. And of course, you can add multiple points to this curve. So for example, we could add red to the highlights, and you can see the clouds get redder, and we can add cyan or remove red from the shadows. So you see that the shadows become cyan, or they have the red sucked out of them. And we can do that with each of the 3 color channels. So let's do that very quickly. So that was red, now green. So if we boost the brightness of the green channel, things get more green. The image as a whole gets brighter, of course, as well, because you're effectively adding green light to the image. And then if we drag the curve down, then you see the image becomes purple, because magenta purple is opposite to green on the color wheel. So the image gets darker as well, because we're in this case subtracting light. We're subtracting green light. And then finally, if we select the blue channel, we push that one up and everything gets bluer, and we push it down and you can see the image gets increasingly yellow, because yellow is opposite to blue on the color wheel. So that's how it works, and in much the same way, all of these channels you can add as many points as you want to do very specific things. So before I do the kind of edit that I would actually choose to do, and let's just reset that channel there. What I'm going to do is talk about how you could use these curves for a kind of creative coloration of your images, because there are some people who would choose to use curves for that purpose because it gives so much control. I actually think it would be easier to use split toning curves or the new adjustments in Lightroom, but it's going to be good for understanding what these curves do. So let's say what we want to do is open up the shadows and make them blue, and then we'll just try and make the highlights a lot warmer, so try and create a bit of color contrast between midtones and highlights and the shadows. So I'm going to go into the blue channel here, and I'm going to add blue to the shadows. So as I push this black point up here, that means my blacks are going to have some blue introduced to them, but of course that's happening across the entire image. So to make sure it doesn't affect the midtones, I need to drag this line down, so you can see it's actually become very flat in this blue channel here, but at least it's going to give us a good illustration of the change we're making. And I'm trying not to affect anywhere else on that curve. I appreciate this isn't quite so clear because the blue line doesn't stand out quite as well as that as the white one in the RGB histogram there. But so we've now added some blue to our shadows and a little bit to the darker midtones. Now we're going to try and add some warmth. So let's add some red into the midtones and the highlights. I don't actually want to make my whites red. I just want to do that to the brighter midtones. So let's sort of create an S curve here, something like that. Make sure that the shadows aren't affected. And this looks a bit too pink and weird, so we actually need to add some green in to make the colors here a bit warmer, a bit yellower, a bit oranger, because it's red and green in combination that create yellow. And in order to use this curves palette effectively, you are going to need to develop an understanding of how colors in combination, red, green and blue in combination, create certain colors, because that's that kind of understanding is going to help you remove color casts and so on, which I'm going to go into in a second. So that's our goal achieved there. We've added some warmth to the highlights and we've added some blues into the shadows. And of course you can continue on with this, maybe add a bit of contrast here and there, darken down those midtones to create some mood. And you can really do whatever you want to the colors of an image using this curves tool and playing around with those color curves. Personally, I don't do this kind of thing myself at all. I use the color curves purely for color correction, and of course that's what I'm going to go into now. So that I can illustrate what's actually going on with this edit, I'm going to start with another really silly example. What I want you to do is imagine that we have a gigantic bright red flashlight behind us that's lighting the entire scene with a certain amount of red light. And I'm going to simulate that by creating a pure red layer. So here we have a layer that's filled with pure red, and because it's light and not paint, I'm going to select this linear dodge add blend mode here. You'll just have to trust me that this is akin to simulating light, and I'm going to turn the opacity down to 10%. So here's the before and here's the after when we're shining this red light on the entire scene. So this is a color cast, a red color cast that was introduced artificially. What I want to know is, can I remove this using curves? And the answer is yes, you can remove it absolutely perfectly. So I create a new curves adjustment layer, and what I'm going to do first is just talk through the layers. And we're going to start with blue. So here is the blue histogram. You can see it's fairly evenly distributed. And if we look at the green histogram, okay, it's a little bit more over to the left, but still fairly evenly distributed. But if we look at the red histogram, you can see that that black point is actually a fair bit off to the right. And if I turn this layer off, you can see here's where the histogram was before. So by adding that red over the top of the image, the red light, we've actually moved the histogram off to the right. And that's kind of the clue to how we're going to solve this, because by setting a new black point in the red channel, we can actually move the histogram back to where it was before we added that red layer. So all we have to do in this case is drag this point in so that we set a new black point in the red channel. And then if I turn that layer on and off, you can see we're cutting through that red. But if I turn off both of these at the same time, you can see there's the before and there's the after. So they are absolutely identical. So we added red light, and if we wanted to, we could actually flatten these two together. So this is just an image with a red color cast now, and you can see that this curves layer does correct that red color cast. So that's a really useful concept to understand, because color casts can come in many forms. Of course, they could be white balance errors, so you can use the curves tool to correct white balance errors if you must. They're really better for making small localized changes, because you'd be better off fixing white balance problems in your raw converter. But nevertheless, it's useful to understand that you can do that. But they're particularly useful for correcting local color casts. And there's two particular examples, one of which we're going to go into here, which is the reduction of haze But another really good example is image flares, lens flares, which often take on specific colors, quite commonly red in my experience with Canon lenses. And you can use this exact method to effectively paint out lens flares, which I'll cover in a separate video purely on that subject. But here we're going to talk about the reduction of haze. So anyway, just so that you're really clear, that curves adjustment there, all we did was set a new black point in the red channel, and that effectively restored the histogram to where it was before we added that red layer over the top of it. So I'm just going to undo what we did there, and let's get rid of these two curves layers, or the two layers I added, and we're going to cut through some of this haze. So we do that by creating a new curves adjustment. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, the haze kind of takes on two forms. Firstly, it reduces contrast, and secondly, it introduces a blue cast. So one thing we could start by doing is just trying to add some contrast to cut through the haze in the background and just see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint a layer mask over the top of the scene here. So I'm going to hold down the shift key as I drag a soft gradient through these islands, because if you imagine what the haze is doing, it gradually increases as we get further and further away. So there's a tiny bit of haze here maybe, but the haze starts the further we get away from where we are. So by the time we've got to these islands, let's say we've got 50% haze, and by the time we're at the mountain at the back here, we've got 90% haze, and then 100% haze at the very, very distance here. So it sort of increases as we look into the distance. But this gradient mask will do a decent job of approximating that. So I'm going to alt click on the mask just so that you can see where I've painted it. So this adjustment is going to apply 100% to the top of the image, which is where the mountain is and where most of that haze is, but to a lesser and lesser degree as we get closer to my position. So let's add some contrast first. So firstly, we've got the updated histogram here, and you can actually see if I just look at the entire image histogram, you can see we do have some true blacks in the entire image histogram because there's some blacks on the island here. But we don't looking into the distance because unsurprisingly the haze has brightened those blacks, and if I just zoom in you can see there is absolutely no black in this image, and that's what this histogram is reflecting. So we can start by setting a black point. Let's just drag this slider off to the right until we start to cut through that haze a little bit. And you can see already we have improved the contrast here a fair amount. So here's before and here's after. We've done a pretty good job already at revealing what's behind that mist. And you could play around more with an S-curve if you wanted to just add even more contrast, although personally I tend to just use that black point trick, and that's got us part of the way there. But of course we have also increased that blue because we've added contrast, so you can actually see it visibly gets bluer, and it's that we want to avoid. So if I look at the blue channel here, you'll see that it's right off to the right here. Now, why is it so far off to the right? Because when we looked at the blue channel for the entire image, and if I click on the histogram up here, you can see, okay, there's nothing that's a pure black in that blue channel, but it's still fairly close to the left edge there. But in the distance it isn't. Well, that's because we're looking through haze. So blue has effectively been added across the entire image in the distance here. And that's why the histogram is bunched off to the right hand side, because it has more blue added to it effectively. And it's that blue that we want to remove in much the same way we did with that artificial red layer that I added. And of course we do that in exactly the same manner. We move the black point of the blue channel off to the right. And as we do, you can see that the image, if anything, looks like it might be getting slightly green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of the blue out of this until it looks like there's no blue cast at all. And then I'm going to have a look at the other color channels to see if I can get a better result still, because maybe this is starting to look a bit yellow as well. You can see the cloud up there looks a little insipid. So let's select the green slider here. So if we reduce green, we actually add magenta. So that might do us some favors here, or add a bit of red almost. And you can see as I move this black point off to the right, suddenly the mountain starts to look quite a natural color. We've got some warmish greens coming through here where the sunlight's hitting this Torridonian sandstone. We've got the warmer colours coming through. In fact, I think this is Lewisian gneiss, just so that somebody doesn't correct me here. But I think that's looking pretty natural in the background there. It looks fairly neutral, almost as if we weren't looking through that much haze at all. And of course we can be even more aggressive with that black point if we want to, if you wanted to cut through more of that haze in the back, although I don't think we really want to in this case. So hopefully you can see that that adjustment there has almost magically cut through all the atmospheric haze. But there's a couple more things I want you to notice. One is that where the mountainside here is a little bit closer to my position, actually we have less haze. And this side is now looking overworked, it's looking too dark. And so we actually need to modify our mask here so that it doesn't have that negative impact. So I'm going to select quite a large brush. I've got the caps lock on, which is why I can't see my brush size. And I'm going to make sure it's nice and soft. And I'm going to set the opacity to 30%. So this is where the sort of layer masking aspects of the last video come in, because if you don't understand that, then this will be harder to understand. So you can see as I paint black in here, some of that blue actually returns. And I think that creates a more natural result, to be honest, even though we're actually undoing the change that we just made. So I'd go back and forth with this a little bit, just making sure that it looks absolutely right. And of course we could actually apply the adjustment more heavily into the distance because there's more haze there. But there's a reason I'm not going to bother with that, and that's because we actually want haze. We want the haze because it gives us depth in our images. It gives us a sense of everything receding into the distance, a sense of place as well. And if you remove all the atmospherics from your image, not only does the image become untruthful, but it becomes less relatable. It doesn't look as real. It doesn't feel right. So often when I'm making these adjustments, I go pretty much full bore with it. I'll try and make the adjustment to its fuller extent to try and remove as much haze as possible. But in my final step, I very significantly reduce the opacity of that adjustment. So I'm going to leave it at about 35% here, because what I don't want to do is remove the haze. I just want to reduce it. I just want to see through the haze a little better. I want the haze to be there because it's part of the scene. It's part of the beauty of the scene, and you have to recognize these subtleties in the things that you're photographing. So here is the before. And here is the after, and you can see just how we've cut through that blue and the sort of wishy-washiness of that haze looking into the distance. But it's still there. It doesn't feel untruthful to me to do that. We've improved the image subtly. It's going to allow the viewer to enjoy the scene a little bit more because you can see into the distance that little bit more. But we're not taking it too far. So that's one example of how you can use the color curves to do something very specific in reducing haze. But if you understand the concept of how these color curves can be used, you have the ability to add color to different areas of your image in different ways. And certainly if you start using the 3 channels in combination, then you can affect any color in any way. And you can use that for problem solving if you understand that concept, because there will be some of you watching this who no doubt already now know how to remove lens flare from your images using that curves tool. But that is exactly what I will be discussing in a future video. I will be spending an entire video just dedicated to how you can use the curves tool to remove flare. So I hope you found that useful. I hope you followed along. I also hope you've watched part 1 and part 2, because otherwise this probably hasn't been too easy to understand. Please do give me your feedback. I really appreciate it. It does take me a lot of time to make these, as I've said many times before, and having the feedback from the community does help to keep me motivated. And of course, please do like and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more in future.